Imagine standing on a battlefield in October 1881. The ground vibrates with the rumble of guns. The air stings with smoke, and powder burns your nostrils. Before you, straight lines of red coats, Britain's confident soldiers. And here, in this noise and haze, something happens the British didn't expect. Not the sudden genius of one commander, not a miracle musket, not a secret guerrilla trick. A different kind of weapon kicks in an alliance, multiplied by technology and sea power. Many know Yorktown as the last battle of the War of Independence. But why did the army of the seemingly invincible British Empire surrender in a small coastal town in Virginia? The answer lies in a combination of forces that converged at one point in one moment. A fleet, artillery, engineering mastery, and ironclad coordination with American resolve. By 1781, the war had dragged on for 6 years. Britain, a global power with the strongest navy and a professional army. The American colonists, yesterday's farmers and craftsmen, men without a standard uniform and with mismatched arms, often hunting pieces. They were driven by an idea of liberty, but lacked the discipline of Europe's big armies, the factories for supply, and the money. The war's early years brought the Americans heavy defeats. New York fell. Philadelphia was occupied. Many thought the rebellion would be crushed, the colonies brought back under the crown, and George Washington remembered as the leader of a failed gamble. The turn came in 1778, when France, still smarting from the 7 Years' War, entered the conflict on America's side. People usually mention French troops and guns, but France brought more than crates of muskets and a couple of regiments. It brought the sea a major fleet and a school Europe's engineering and artillery science of siege warfare. In the summer of 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis, campaigning through the Carolinas and Virginia, received orders to fortify a base on the Virginia coast. He chose the small port town of Yorktown on a peninsula between the York and James Rivers, an excellent point for resupply by sea. Cornwallis had around 7,500 men and built redoubts, lines, and palisades. His plan was simple. Even if the Americans besieged him, the Royal Navy would sail into the bay, bring provisions, and evacuate the troops if needed. Meanwhile, Washington sat near New York, making it look like he was preparing a large assault. Then came the news. A major French squadron under Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse was heading for American waters. Not a few ships, but 28 ships of the line-floating fortresses, with 60-80 guns each. Washington changed the plan in an instant. If de Grasse was sailing not to New York, but to the Chesapeake, exactly where Cornwallis sat, then that's where the blow must fall. The decision was paradoxical. Abandon the main target of New York and secretly move the army south. For the maneuver to work, the British in New York must not guess the real direction. Washington staged a theater. He set up dummy bake ovens, as if preparing for a long siege, sent out conspicuous reconnaissance parties, and fed useful tidbits to known British spies. At the same time, American troops and the French Corps under Rochambeau began their march to Virginia. Columns were split, routes masked, movements desynchronized to confuse observers. The logistics were titanic. More than 7,000 Americans, about 5,000 French, heavy artillery, wagons, forage, ammunition, river crossings, dozens of moving parts that had to click together quickly before the British staff in New York realized the main target was a decoy. By the time the British noticed Washington's army had vanished from New York, it was too late. The Allies were halfway to Virginia, and French sails were already gleaming at the bay's mouth. On September 5th, 1781, two fleets met at the entrance to the Chesapeake. De Grasse's French and Admiral Thomas Graves's British, with 19 ships of the line. The fight raged for hours. Heavy guns roared, spars cracked, decks filled with splinters. It wasn't a cinematic victory. No one annihilated the other outright. Both sides took damage. But the strategic outcome was clear. The French held the bay, and the British fleet withdrew to New York for repairs. Cornwallis's sentence was signed. Without the fleet, no supply, no rescue. Yorktown turned from a fortress into a trap. In late September, Washington and Rochambeau tightened the ring around the town. They didn't throw men against the walls. They opened the textbook of European siege warfare. On the night of October 6th, they began digging the first parallel, a long, zigzag trench at a safe distance from British batteries. Then, into pre-surveyed positions, they hauled heavy guns and mortars. Each piece weighed hundreds or thousands of kilograms. It wasn't just about getting it there. You had to set the angle, brace the carriage, bring up ammunition, and organize communications and observation. On October 9th, by tradition, Washington fired the first shot himself. The ball smashed a table of British officers, and the batteries thundered in reply. More than 50 Allied guns opened up almost without pause. This is where the French artillery school showed in full. It wasn't a louder cannon. It was precision of elevation, calculation of powder charges, accounting for wind and temperature, practiced rates of fire, discipline in cooling and rotating tubes, and the quality of powder and shot. French round shot flew truer. Their mortars lobbed bombs on high arcs, so they fell almost vertically into trenches and courtyards, bursting overhead. British batteries answered, but there were fewer of them. Their positions were being smashed, barrels overheated and failed. 18th century artillery was the cutting edge of military tech. Bronze and iron barrels were cast by complex methods, calibers matched to the diameter of the balls, carriages engineered for recoil, and powder had to produce consistent pressures. The French brought everything needed for the ideal siege: heavy siege guns to batter walls, mortars to throw shells over ramparts, howitzers, a flexible middle ground between direct and high-angle fire. And they brought men who had spent years learning to compute trajectories. They fired in series, timed bomb fuses to burst, neither too early nor too late, adjusted elevations by fall of shot, distributed targets among batteries, concentrated fire on active British guns, and weak points in the fortifications. The engineers weren't bystanders. They oversaw digging, the placement of gabions, large wicker baskets filled with earth serving as mobile shields, and fascines, bundles of brush, to shore up parapets and walkways. They cut trenches in zigzags, so a single lucky shot wouldn't sweep them lengthwise. Batteries were positioned to cover each other, and communication between lines was protected by covered ways. It was hard, muddy work. Thousands labored by night, carrying, digging, constantly under the risk of counterfire. But the system worked like a clock. To bring the guns even closer, the second parallel had to go in nearer to the town. Two forward works stood in the way, redoubts number 9 and 10. They had to be taken by storm. It would be short, brutal, risky work in the dark and under fire. Night of October 14th, Washington sent Americans under Lieutenant-Colonel Alexander Hamilton against redoubt number 10. French troops under Baron de Viomenil, spelled variously in sources, but the operation is the same, went for redoubt number 9. The plan: fire as little as possible, close as fast as possible, get over, and clear it with bayonets and clubbed muskets. Half an hour of hellish hand-to-hand fighting, and both redoubts were taken. From that moment, the Allies could push the second parallel in almost to touching distance, and the range for their guns became murderous for the town's defense. On October 16th, Cornwallis tried one last card, a night crossing of the York River to ferry part of the army to the north bank and break out by land. A storm smashed the plan. Wind and waves kept the boats from moving. The crossing collapsed. By morning, the troops had to return under fire. It was the last door, and it slammed shut. Cornwallis's works were crumbling. His guns were silent. His men exhausted, sick, hungry. On October 17th, a British drummer climbed the ruins and beat the call for a parley. The guns fell silent. Negotiations began. On October 19th, the surrender ceremony took place. Cornwallis claimed illness and did not appear. His deputy, General Charles O'Hara, presented the sword. He first tried to hand it to Rochambeau, the French commander, but Rochambeau gestured to Washington. Washington, following protocol, directed his own deputy, General Benjamin Lincoln, to accept the surrender. Strict, spare, without gloating. The British band played "The World Turned Upside Down." It wasn't a metaphor. For the first time, an imperial army surrendered to colonists allied with a European power on their soil. More than 7,000 British soldiers marched into captivity. Hundreds of guns, thousands of muskets, and piles of supplies were left behind. Strip away the romance, and the answer is sober. Control of the sea, plus superiority in artillery, plus the engineering school, victory. De Grasse's fleet sealed Yorktown off. Without access by sea, there was no supply, no evacuation, no hope of holding out for relief. French artillery outclassed the British, not by numbers, but by quality. Better cast barrels, truer shot, steadier powder, trained crews, and faster corrections. Engineers delivered speed and safety in the siege works lines, batteries, logistics, communications. And it only worked because it was all brought together in sync with American resolve, marches, deception, and leadership. That's the real secret. Not a new piece of iron, but the addition of strengths. Why was French artillery so fearsome? Because it wasn't just a gun. It was the sum of decades of progress in metallurgy, geometry, ballistics, and practice. Hot shot against ships, grape and canister against infantry, heavy round shot to smash walls, mortar bombs to strike behind ramparts. French artillery officers knew which ammunition to use for which target, how to time bomb fuses to burst, neither too early nor too late, how to mass fire on key points. Quality produced tempo. Where British guns flowered and needed breathers more often, French batteries kept up steady work. Siege lines aren't just a ditch. They're a system. You need to read the soil, drain water, pick width and depth, cover and angles. You must lay out trenches so the enemy can't rake them end to end. You must move shot and powder under fire. You must account for fatigue, cold nights, sickness. The French school had answers. Put gabions in front and dig under their cover. Brace soft sides with fascines. Advance saps in zigzags. Build traverses so splinters and canister don't travel down the communication trench. Within a few nights, the Allies crawled close enough to British walls that distance favored the attackers. Don't lose the American role amid praise for the French. The assault on Redoubt No. 10 was carried out by Americans under Hamilton. Washington was the architect of the New York deception, the man who kept the army together in its darkest years. His ability to cooperate was a rare gift. Rochambeau, A more experienced European general deliberately recognized Washington as overall commander without jealousy or scene-making. Their duet is a lesson in allies working for outcomes rather than for titles. Surrender and aftermath. In London, when news of the surrender arrived, Prime Minister Lord North is said to have murmured, "Oh God, it's all over." It wasn't the end of peace talks, but it was the point of no return. Britain would mount no more major offensives in America. Diplomacy took over. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized U.S. independence, and the new nation's borders were set. Yorktown's impact reached beyond a single war. France, helping America, took on debts and caught the fever of liberty. Within a few years, it would erupt into revolution. Britain learned the limits of force without public backing and began managing its empire more flexibly. The United States absorbed lessons on the value of professional artillery, logistics, and a navy. Later would come the idea of military schools and academies, eventually West Point, and a homegrown engineering artillery tradition. Technology and science at work. In those days, a cannon was high technology. Casting a barrel meant balancing strength and weight. Powder was the chemistry of consistency. Round shot was geometry and mass. Mortars required complex calculations of fuse time and trajectory height. Every mistake cost lives. A fuse burned too quickly, an airburst too early, too damp a dud that had to be diffused under fire, a misjudged rangeovers or shorts, and a battery lost its tempo. The French brought not just tubes, but a method. It was an early scientific organization of fire, firing tables, wind corrections, battery coordination, standard procedures on the line. All this turned unwieldy guns into a precision instrument. Logistics, the invisible hero. Moving 16,000 Allied soldiers, dragging siege guns, feeding men, keeping ammunition flowing, organizing medical care, bringing tools for digging, that's a weapon too. It doesn't shoot, but without it, nothing shoots. Americans and French succeeded because 1,000 small tasks were done on time. Bridges prepared, wagons scheduled, halts arranged, guards posted, runners on the clock. Yorktown was won not by the strength of a single gun, but by the sum of right actions that make a big operation work. The storm as a symbol of providence. History loves details. The night squall that wrecked Cornwallis's river crossing became, for many, the finger of fate. Yes, weather, chance, 18th century meteorology. But to people of the time, it was Providence intervention from above. When outcomes balance on a hair, such episodes give the story depth. Not everything yields to planning, yet planning still matters. Yorktown's lessons that don't expire, alliances decide. One-on-one, the weak yield to the strong. With the right partner, odds flip dramatically. Sea power is the key to victory on land. Whoever controls the bay controls supply. Without the sea, a fortress becomes a trap. Technology and training beat bravery alone. A brave soldier with bad powder and untrued guns loses to a trained crew with good firing tables. Engineering multiplies force. A properly dug trench and a well-sighted battery save lives and save shot. Logistics is the operation's nervous system. Food, forage, horses, roads, bridges, powder magazines. This isn't housekeeping. It's the lifeline. Command is also diplomacy. Washington and Rochambeau show how different military cultures can act as one for a shared goal. Why this is a story about people, not just guns. Behind the numbers are people. Americans endured years of defeat, hungry winters, epidemics, and disillusionment. Washington, time and again, balanced on the edge of an army dissolving holding officers and men with promises, character, and personal example. French sailors and gunners risked their lives for a cause that wasn't their national war, but was their idea and political choice. British soldiers at Yorktown were people too. They wept at the surrender, smashed stocks on the ground, cursed, and kept silent. For them, the world turned upside down wasn't grand metaphor. It was personal collapse. What comes afterward? The practical end of the American War happened here. Politically, it rolled on to the Treaty of Paris in 1783, but the powder had cooled. The United States became a recognized state, with borders south of the Great Lakes and east of the Mississippi. Europe absorbed the lessons. Armies need engineers and artillerists. A navy is not a luxury, but a necessity. Alliances are tools of strategy, not occasions for vanity. For France, participation became one brick in the wall of looming revolution, economic and ideological. For Britain, painful but not fatal schooling. Empires survive when they adapt. The secret weapon as a formula. If you formalize Yorktown, you get almost a textbook equation. Secret weapon, sea control by de Grasse. French artillery and engineering. American resolve and maneuver. Staff coordination. Logistics. Luck, weather. Each term is a multiplier. Remove one and the whole thing may collapse. But when all the elements align, even an invincible army yields its sword. Final thought. Yorktown isn't only about cannonballs. It's about the power of an idea that people carried for 6 hard years. About an alliance where everyone did their part and acknowledged the others. About professionalism that, at the critical moment, weighs more than raw courage. About the way history is a chain of small right actions multiplied by discipline and belief in the goal. If someone asks, so what was Yorktown's secret weapon? The answer is simple and elegant. An alliance multiplied by science and people who didn't quit until the world turned upside down. Everything else is technique. Amen.